Hello. I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Rabbi Ben Scolnic. I'm coming to you by video because tonight is the first night of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And as a rabbi, I'll be leading services, so that's why I can't be with you. And sorry that I can't be in person. I have a very easy task to talk about a few thousand years of storytelling in 5 or 6 minutes. So let me try to breeze through some of the slides that I've prepared for this. And so call this a rabbi's perspective on storytelling. We'll start with the Bible. The Hebrew Bible has many stories. In other words, there are certain texts of certain religions that really have one basic story, but the Hebrew Bible, as you know, has many stories. And something I want to emphasize is that they're very often given in parallel accounts. And I think of this as reading horizontally. Um, that is, that we'll read one story, and source criticism will say, well, there's a documentary hypothesis and things, but when you're reading in story after story, there's more than one account. There's more than one version of the story. Two accounts of creation, two reasons for the flood, how many clean animals are in the ark, where Abraham was born, was Ishmael rejected, or was he actually not rejected? Why Jacob left Canaan, who bought and sold Joseph, when did God tell Moses his real name, what are the Ten Commandments? And so if you have two stories for each of these events, and I could go on and on. There are two versions of the conquest. One is called the Book of Joshua, one is called the Book of Judges. So it's not it happened this way, but the story has been told this way. It means that the story means this when told like this, and that when told like that. And what it leads to is a pluralistic mind, right? Because it's not this is what happened. It's, well, there's a story about that it happened this way, and there's a story about it happened that way. Um, and there's one of the basic Jewish stories of all time is that there are two people who are arguing, and they come to a rabbi, and one gives his account, and the rabbi says, you're right. And the other guy gives his very contrary account, and the rabbi says, you're right. And a person says, well, wait a minute, rabbi, they can't both be right. He says, you're also right. That's very Jewish. That is, truth is very complex, and we're not simple-minded about it. So the pluralistic mind encourages us not only to hear our stories, but to hear the stories of other cultures. The pluralistic mind, coming from the biblical way of telling those stories, opens our minds. Um, but there's also stories are told qua stories. So just two very quickly. Um, uh, David has sinned with Bathsheba. It is an adulterous, murderous affair because he's had Bathsheba's husband Uriah the Hittite put on the front line so he gets killed, so that he can have this beautiful woman Bathsheba. And Nathan comes to David and he tells this story about a rich man and a poor man. I don't have time to read it with you. And he sort of sucks David in. And so David gets very mad at the rich man. And then Nathan says, you are the man. So it's a parable. If you're a Christian, you know that Jesus very often talked through parables. Um, and in this case, the parable is interpreted, it's clear, David gets it, but by accepting the terms of the parable, he has convicted himself. And in another story, just a couple of chapters later in 2 Samuel, Joab, David's cousin and chief mafioso and things like that, wants to bring David's Absalom home. And so he tells this wise woman of Tekoa to tell a story about her son. And David again gets sucked into it. And then the woman is able to say, look, just like my son should be saved, you should bring your son home. So these are stories that are told as stories, right? And they become events in the history of Israel. So in the case of Nathan, it's an incredible story. He's speaking truth to power. He is the quintessential prophet of going up, and saying to the king, that he's wrong and that he's guilty. Now, so that's horizontal, that in the Bible you'll have these different stories and stories, as stories. But moving down through Jewish history, you have something called Midrash. And Midrash will take biblical stories and re-biograph them. It already happens in the Bible when David, who has lots of sins, like in the case of Bathsheba I was just mentioning, in 1 Chronicles, that story doesn't appear. So David is already getting re-biographed within the Bible itself. But Midrash is interpretation of the Bible that was done over hundreds of years, mostly in the Common Era, from, I say, the 2nd century to the 5th century, but that's sort of just general. The Midrash will make ethical or theological problems in the Bible go away. That's what I'm also calling rebiographing. And then Rashi, the greatest medieval Jewish traditional commentator, and others will take that, will make that Midrashic version seem to be the meaning of the text. So here's another case. We all know the story of baby Moses in the bulrushes, and how Pharaoh's daughter sees that there's a baby, and she sends a handmaid, an alma, to get the baby out of the bulrushes. But in the Midrash, alma can also mean like a cubit, and so that her arm extends. So it's not the handmaiden alma, it's her long arm. I don't know if you ever saw Gumby, but Gumby's like arm will stretch. And so Midrash will also increase the miraculous. The Bible has plenty of miracles. The Midrash will even increase that. So I was asked about, well, what is the role of women in the stories? Well, everything that I did in the lecture, this morning. But also, one of the points I'm not sure if I made clearly this morning is that when you have Sarah or Rebecca or Hannah, you have these women in relationships with husbands and fathers. I think that this reflects a social reality. That is, I understand it was a patriarchal society. I'm not apologizing for that. But within that, I think that you have a reflex of the way that people actually related to each other. And that's what makes those stories work, those stories true. That all those assertive women that I was talking about reflect a social reality. Now, another aspect of Jewish storytelling is Jewish humor. Now, the Jewish people have been through an awful lot in thousands of years, and somehow we've survived. And one of the ways that we've survived, I call a deep sense of humor. But it's also this humility. Don't take yourself too seriously. 2 very quick stories. So rabbis will use humor all the time. I tell jokes probably every day of my life as a rabbi. And so the rabbis will start with themselves. So they'll tell these jokes. Like, there's a rabbi who was trying out for a synagogue, and a woman comes up to him afterwards and says, "Rabbi, that was the worst sermon I ever heard." And the rabbi's really very upset. He was hoping to get this job. And he goes over to the president of the synagogue. He says, "You know what that woman just said to me? She said that was the worst sermon, that my audition sermon was the worst sermon she ever heard." He says, "Well, don't worry about that. She only repeats what everybody else says." And another story about rabbis is there's a very pious rabbi, and he is a wonderful person and a wonderful pastor, but he can't speak very well. He has a brother who is a ne'er-do-well, and he is a cab driver, a taxi driver, and he's a terrible taxi driver. People take their heart in their hands when they drive with him. He's so terrible. And the rabbi and his brother, his taxi driver brother, die on the same day, and they both go to heaven. And the rabbi sees that his brother is sitting next to God at the banquet, and he's like on the 7th level down. So he says to God, "Master of the universe, why is that?" And God says, "You have to understand, when you spoke, the people slept, but when your brother drove, the people prayed." So these are examples of Jewish humor, and that self-deprecation, that humility, reflects the idea that none of us are perfect, and we can all take a jibe at ourselves. Now, something that Altai asked me to mention is that we have these unheard voices of the past. The idea really started with Altai, um, and he had done something like "I am Pericles," and then I took it from there. And I think he told me that we've done about 200 of these. Um, and these are imagining lost letters from or dialogues with ancient figures to try to make them come alive as people who have important things to say to our time. And so this is just a list where, Alexander the Great, or it's actually Parmenion. And I'm actually talking about that in Barcelona in February using this creative idea. We had, I think, 35. Um, uh, the idea was that these scholars were talking to Homer and asking him questions about the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in each one of these cases, we try to make them about democracy or values or something. And what's the idea? We had Seneca, you see all these different things we had. Um, and and so what is the idea? The idea is like we're in a time when the humanities are on the run. Everything is STEM. How can we make these unheard, these ancient voices speak to this generation? So one of the ideas is uh, make them come alive as people who have important things to say to our time. Um, and so just to conclude, we are the stories we tell, and when we hear them, we understand who we are. So thank you for listening.